Hello and welcome to the Kingdom Strength podcast. My name is Troy Briscoe, your host. Today we are talking about periodization. This is part 2 of a 3-part series about exercise programming. 3 podcasts ago, we discussed principles of exercise programming. And today we're continuing the discussion to specifically cover different models of periodization. So the goal today is to introduce you to different models or styles of periodization and provide examples of when you might want to select said model of periodization. Before we begin, we'll get a quick recap as to what periodization is. Periodization is a structured organization of training variables to manage fatigue and produce targeted adaptations. It's a way to structure a training plan in order to capitalize on particular characteristics that are relevant to the athlete and to be sure that it's programmed in a way that doesn't cause too much fatigue or risk of injury. So there's different ways to go about it, and we'll be getting into that today. Before we begin, I have utilized all of these models that we'll discuss today in client programming. Again, you might want to select one versus the other depending on the goal, and I'll give you an idea of when that might be when we discuss each model. Just some more background. I've been writing programs for a little over 8 years now. I'm a personal trainer and certified strength conditioning specialist and have worked with a variety of clientele, many different athletes within different domains, from football and field athletes to marathon runners to athletes that perform more short bursts like sprinters and track athletes, as well as general population and kind of weekend warriors as well, more hybrid athletes, people working for high rocks, working toward their first, second, third high rocks competitions. So you name it, I have some sort of experience with it. Of course, there are certain athletes I haven't had the pleasure of working with, but slowly growing that as time goes on. So all that to say, I just wanted to provide some reference as to, hey, all these models we'll talk about today have some utility, and I have some experience with putting them into practice. And I'm excited for you to do the same. So let's get into it, shall we? Different models of periodization. We're going to begin with probably the most classic or traditional, if you will, literally called traditional periodization, also called linear periodization. This is simply when you are progressively increasing towards sport-specific characteristics, adaptations within the program. So you're starting with broad training stimulus and getting to specific training stimulus. Generically speaking, this is typically seen where the volume, if we're talking resistance training, that is, if volume usually is higher at the beginning of a linear periodization model, and you slowly progress the intensity, so you're increasing the load and then decreasing the volume as time goes on. For example, starting with hypertrophy early on in the program, then moving into strength and strength speed, and then you're getting into the power and plyometrics, and then to sport-specific qualities. That's a very general way to think about linear periodization. Within the endurance athlete context, I talked about this in my podcast about marathon training, I like to utilize a model called reverse linear periodization. And this is specifically in reference to the volume utilized within the program for the running aspect of the marathon program, because the sport specific quality being trained is the aerobic capacity and miles on the road, right? If you're doing a road marathon, that is. So what this would look like is you're starting with the resistance training. You are beginning with the volume or endurance qualities, hypertrophy qualities, and then moving into strength as the volume of mileage will increase. Because it doesn't make any sense to program a bunch of mileage out of the start and then wean it down from there. You're going to be slowly increasing mileage. A general recommendation is 5 to 10% increase of total weekly volume per week, per literature by Tim Gabbett and others. So the reverse linear periodization is in reference to the sport-specific quality of endurance training, going from small amount of mileage, increasing it, building capacity to tolerate the large amount of mileage, increasing tissue capacity slowly over time, and starting with perhaps a lower amount of volume, and then actually more intense intervals, things like that early on to generate VO2 max adaptations and increasing that bucket early on in the program, and then integrating it there into more of a generally increasing aerobic capacity from there, from that base. So again, that reverse linear periodization I like to use for the marathon training. So that volume, mileage increasing, intensity is increasing for resistance training, so volume is going down there. You kind of have that inverse effect, if you will. So I just wanted that piece on reverse linear periodization in there. Stepping back into traditional or linear periodization, you might want to use this for athletes that have a relatively short in-season period, or perhaps like one major event that they're training for, so you can appropriately progress them toward that event. For example, linear periodization was made very popular within the Olympic sports. So there's one large competition every 4 years. And of course, there might be world championships and things like that in between, but even then, it's not very frequent. So linear periodization allows them to slowly develop toward one characteristic or specific adaptation that is relevant toward their sport. Linear periodization might not be good for athletes that have a very long in-season, or if they have to compete very regularly throughout the year. So some of these other models that we'll discuss today might be better fit for those athletes. Speaking of which, undulating periodization is another model that might be best fit for those athletes that are competing more regularly or have a longer in-season. So what is undulating periodization? Undulating periodization is when the primary adaptation being trained switches on a daily or weekly basis. So there's two different types of undulating periodization: daily undulating periodization or weekly undulating periodization. Very simply, as easy as it sounds, daily undulating periodization is where the main stimulus being delivered with each workout changes each workout within the week. So for example, what that would look like is perhaps a strength session on Monday, a hypertrophy session on Wednesday, and a power session on Friday, for example. A weekly undulating periodization is when that full week is catered toward one specific stimulus, and then The week after that will be catered to another one, and so on and so forth. For example, 1 week of strength, another week of hypertrophy, another week of power, for example. So the advantage of this is to potentially capitalize on multiple demands or characteristics at one time. Obviously, when you're working on multiple things at one time, you can't quite achieve the same peak that you will going after one characteristic. But this could be good for people, like I said, who need to be more ready for multiple adaptations, like a hybrid athlete, for example, or somebody who needs to be able to compete and express different qualities multiple times throughout the year. And earlier I mentioned long in-season periods. This might be useful, and that is simply because, say they're training hypertrophy and then strength within the off season, and then working on power, plyometrics, and sport-specific training sessions within the in season. If the in season is really long, then they're not quite developing, perhaps, the strength and hypertrophy and maintaining those adaptations. And they might generate some fatigue or overtraining, overreaching in scenarios where they're doing the, same style of training or just competing for a very long period of time, right? So doing undulating periodization might be a way to maintain a certain amount of strength or hypertrophy in muscle cross-sectional area throughout the in-season and kind of manage the types of stressors that they're experiencing, and to help them not only focus on, hey, that one specific quality for so long, especially something like competing so frequently where you might run into some potential injury risk or things like that. Of course, there's different ways to implement it, different things to consider based on the individual, based on the sport itself, and that'll be important to consider when working on putting the pieces together with a particular athlete that you're working with. But that's a bit of an example of when you might want to use it and when you might not want to use undulating periodization. A good example might be like baseball, for example, that has a very long in-season period, or basketball or hockey. Hockey, for example, one of my colleagues at Parker Performance Institute, actually, Dr. Kyle Yates, who we did recently a CE course, just recorded a CE course about exercise programming and biomechanics, which should be coming out soon. I will let you listeners know when that is released. But Kyle, he was a hockey athlete, and he says it's becoming increasingly popular to actually do some resistance training after games when the hockey athletes are done, in order to help get this strength and tissue capacity and robustness of tissues in throughout a period where they're playing so many games. So it's a way to just sort of stack on a little bit of that load to the tissues throughout the in-season period. Moving on to the next model that I'll be talking about today, which is block periodization. This is very similar to a linear periodization model, and you honestly could dress it up to look exactly the same as what a linear periodization model could look like, a program utilizing linear periodization. But there are some particular nuances, specifically with the jargon utilized within the block periodization model. Again, the general idea is having blocks or mesocycles, which we discussed in the part 1 podcast of exercise programming. If you haven't heard that one yet, go back a couple podcasts, check that one out. That'll define some of the key concepts in terms as well as principles utilized in exercise programming. Anyway, furthermore, into block periodization, there are blocks utilized that focus on a primary stimulus, and you focus on a stimulus, move on to the next and the next. You can progress it as needed toward a certain goal, but very simply put, there are 3 different phases within the block periodization model. One is the accumulation phase. Second is transmutation phase. Third is the realization phase. So what do these mean? The accumulation period is where you're accruing volume. You can think of this as within the linear model, for example, when you're working on hypertrophy, things like that, accruing volume, accumulating those repetitions, right? And then the transmutation would be where you're acquiring more of that strength, speed, getting into a little bit of that power training, right? So transitioning more into from the off season, getting into the preseason a little bit with transmutation. And then realization, kind of tail end of preseason into the season, where you're actually capitalizing and realizing, if you will, the qualities that you are achieving for the sport, where the accumulation and transmutation laid the foundation in order to express certain qualities that you're trying to elicit to be prepared for this season. So in the realization phase, you can think of it as that power plyometrics and getting into some sport-specific qualities, right? And it's important to note that if you're working with an athlete, typically at that point, you're handing off the athlete into the sport-specific coaches, the position-specific coaches, where they're going to be actually doing a lot of that. Where the strength and conditioning side of things comes in is the resistance training and managing the volume and intensity and everything that goes along with what they're doing in the weight room, right? So whatever your piece to play in the programming puzzle is, it's good to understand these concepts here. So who might want to use a block periodization? Again, similar demographic or population, if you will, with the linear periodization. Say you're trying to, say it's a young athlete, for example. I'm trying to give examples per model, right? So say you have a young football player who just needs to accumulate some cross-sectional area hypertrophy gains and then some strength gains there, trying to increase their foundation to be able to express some of the qualities they're going to need later in their career. So young training age, trying to get some more volume in. So they might need a little bit more of a block style to where they're accumulating a little bit more blocks of the hypertrophy and strength, typically done in the off season, right? And maybe you integrate a little bit of the undulating style in the season when maybe they want to continue to maintain some of those adaptations, just because that might be what this particular athlete needs, right? So it's freedom to mix and match and progress what is needed for the athlete that you're working with, right? So similar style to the linear periodization with the block. The last model we'll be discussing today is the conjugate model. So what is conjugate training? So conjugate training really tries to capitalize on strength and power and speed. Typically, people utilizing the conjugate method are athletes who are in the world of Olympic lifting, powerlifting, and trying to get really strong. So what group that really made this popular was Westside Barbell, which many of you may be familiar with. They kind of popularized this method here. And how do you implement this? How you implement conjugate training is doing the strength work and then the power work within one block. So you can think of it almost similar to undulating, to where you're flipping back and forth to the strength and power. But that's really what they try to focus on. And of course, you can integrate conditioning work and other things like that, depending on the athlete, if that's something that they're trying to to work on, general fitness and metabolic adaptations there. But generally speaking, there's going to be what the conjugate method calls the max strength and the max speed, to where they're utilizing high intensity, high load, low amount of reps, long time under tension within one workout, right? And then say that next workout in the week is focusing on quick bar speed, a little bit lower of a weight per the repetitions that they're doing. So still relatively high weight, but not utilizing the max, if you will. For example, you could utilize a 5 rep max weight and do like 2 or 3 reps of that for 3 or 4 sets or so. So with this, you're able to produce high output with each repetition, high speed, high intent with every single rep, because it is a less amount of reps considering the amount of 1 RM percentage you're utilizing, if that makes sense. So less weight per amount of reps that you're utilizing. Classically, like I said, 5 rep max weight for 2 to 3 reps so that you're able to move the bar quickly. And a lot of times within the dynamic effort or the power focused workouts within the conjugate method, they're utilizing athletes that utilize this are utilizing accommodating resistance. And what this is like chains on the ends of the barbell. And what this does is make the top of the rep more difficult compared to the bottom, because when you go, say, doing a squat and you have chains hanging down from the side of the barbells, and they'll kind of coil up and be on the floor as you descend into the eccentric portion of the squat, and then as you initiate the concentric portion of the squat, you are adding more load because that chain is lifting from the floor a little bit. And what this does is, so you include that weight, you consider that weight when programming, but what it does is it almost makes it more tolerable on the body, because say you're trying to just rip that bar as fast as you can, there's almost like a rebounding effect. You're pushing the bar up and gravity is going to be pushing the bar back down, so it's almost makes it like a ballistic end to the top range of motion there, which could be a lot of force to handle and manage at the top of the rep. So having some of that weight more biased to the easiest part of the lift or the top of the lift makes it a little more tolerable for the system, and to more effectively train that consistent speed throughout the concentric portion of the movement there. So again, conjugate training, you have the dynamic effort that we're talking about, power, and then the max effort with the strength. What this could look like is like Monday, for example, is a lower body max effort strength day. And say Wednesday is a upper body strength day. Say Friday is a lower body power or dynamic effort session. Saturday, upper body dynamic effort or power session. It's one way you could think about programming it, just to allow enough recovery between sessions and to give them enough time to rest between, to be able to accrue those adaptations without accumulating too much fatigue there. And who might want to do the conjugate method here? That could be, like I said at the beginning of the talk or portion about the conjugate method, is power lifters or people trying to really capitalize on the strength and speed and intent into the barbell. And usually within the conjugate method, there are different lifts that are being tracked for the 1 rep max. So what I mean by this is there could be for a squat movement, a squat pattern. Within the conjugate method, an athlete might be tracking their 1RM for the barbell squat, barbell back squat, or barbell front squat, or a split squat, or Hatfield squat, or things like that, to where there's multiple different movements that you're tracking your 1RM weight for, to allow you to cycle through and not burn yourself out on one particular movement. And it makes it easier to almost make some PR or strength gains when you're kind of varying it up a little bit, because it's a little bit easier to hit a PR every month if you're cycling through, and it can be a little bit more engaging as well for the athlete. So those are the models that I wanted to discuss today. And very quickly at the end, I just wanted to have a quick piece about progressions. This will be just a very quick run through of how you might want to progress through, again, with programming and utilizing periodization to program. These models allow you to progress over time toward an event or a certain goal. And different ways to progress could be adjusting load, volume, frequency, tempo. This could be longer time under tension, for example, depending on what you're working toward or what the goal is. You could also vary velocity, exercise complexity, like changing up the nature of the base of support, or if it's going to be a unilateral, bilateral movement, usually going to unilateral can be a progression for stability demands, right? But bilateral is more effective to really generate a lot of load if you're trying to really work on 1 rep maximums. But again, you can integrate as needed. The beautiful thing about programming is the sky is the limit, and it is an art. Moving on to some other ways you can progress could be proximity to failure, kind of maybe working in some fatigue-based training, and this is more popular in hybrid training or high rocks when you're working constantly in a fatigued state. So here, working on some more conditioning stuff and metabolic training, utilizing different energy systems, and trying to make it, again, progressing toward that sport-specific qualities there, even with the energy system work. So those are some ways to progress. Again, it was a very quick list because I'll be going over some more of those concepts in the next podcast for part 3. Specifically, we'll be getting into some of that energy system work and conditioning in the next podcast for part 3. So stay tuned for that. It's going to be a great discussion where you'll get to learn more about programming specifically for conditioning, energy systems, and when you might want to do certain strategies for programming conditioning, when you might want to program certain energy systems, what athletes might require a particular energy system, and how might you progress it throughout a program. That'll be what to expect on the next Kingdom Strength podcast. For now, I hope you gleaned a lot from the discussion today. Again, it was all about periodization, with the definition: periodization being a structured organization of training variables to manage fatigue and to produce targeted adaptations. Then we went into different models of periodization, and no matter which model you use, they all naturally integrate this principle of managing fatigue and organizing training variables. But there might be some nuance in selecting them for a particular athlete that you're working with. So with each definition of each model, I gave some examples of when you might want to use it, when might not you want to use it, and then some ideas for progressions at the end. So that was the recap there. Like I said, stay tuned for part 3, which will be coming out in 2 weeks. Mark your calendars. It'll be all about the conditioning piece and getting into energy system training. So until next time, Stay blessed, and don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. Just wanted to take a moment to say, hope you are enjoying the podcast. Season 2 is nearing an end. We have one more episode, the part 3 in the series about exercise programming. Also wanted to say a reminder, if you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to like and subscribe if you are on YouTube, or to give a rating on Spotify or iTunes if you are enjoying the show from those platforms. Thank you so much. God bless you.